Okay, so the principal isn't. Okay, so we'll start the program. Um, the principal isn't taking the call right now, so I am guessing that he may be in meetings, but he'll join later. So we'll formally start the program. We've started the recording. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first monthly lecture series talk organized by the Department of English Literary Society, Zakir Hussain Delhi College Evening. On behalf of Dr. Shubhra Ray, the TIC, I, Madhumita Chakraborty, and on behalf of my entire department, we take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Dibyaduti Roy to this first monthly lecture series talk. We have planned this he's the first speaker in a monthly series that we plan to have throughout the academic year. The last 1.5 years, as we know, because of the pandemic, our lives have, gone helter-skelter, and unfortunately, we've not been able to organize as much as we would have liked to in normal circumstances. The English department of this college is a very vibrant department. We have our English Literary Society, which of course is run totally by the students. And throughout the year, we organize talks, and we have our departmental fest, ZACLIT, which is organized at the, at the end of the academic session every year. Unfortunately, the 2020 ZACLIT got cancelled just because it was supposed to be held around 17th, 18th March. And as we know, the pandemic hit right then, so we could not organize it. And 2021, of course, also we were unable to do it because it was right at the heart of during the second wave. So hopefully next year we will be in a better situation to do it. I would now like to hand over to Shubhra to welcome the speaker and to carry it forward.
Thank you, Dr. Chakraborty. I extend a warm welcome to everyone, and especially to Dr. Dibyaduti Roy, who is our speaker for today. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce him. Dr. Roy is currently an assistant professor at the Indian Institute of Technology, IIT Jodhpur, with joint appointments in the Division of Digital Humanities, the School of the School of Management and Entrepreneurship, and the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. He has worked in multidisciplinary academic environments across the USA, UK, and India for over a decade. He specializes in Indian digital humanities, new media studies, and theories of masculinity and gender. With a specific focus on Indian DH, he has forthcoming publications in the Global Debates in the DH series, in the volume on DH Pedagogy from the Minnesota University Press, and a chapter in the volume on DH Laboratories from Routledge. In 2020, he was one of the 25 global awardees of the prestigious National Endowment for Humanities Fellowship for the advanced topics in DH Institute at the University of Central Florida. He is the current vice president and one of the founding members of the Digital Humanities Alliance for Research and Teaching Innovations, India's first DH collective, and he has also organized co-organized the first DH conference in India in June 2018. Could I now request Dr. Roy to please make his presentation?
Thank you so much again. I hope I'm audible and visible to everyone. And let me start by sharing screen so that we are sure that we are all on the same screen at least. We're no longer in the same room anymore, which is a sad thing, but we'll have to make do, right? So I hope my PowerPoint screen is visible to everyone. Dr. Ray, can you confirm?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
It is.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Firstly, thank you so much to Zakir Hussain Delhi College and Dr. Ray and Dr. Chakraborty for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk about digital humanities in the Indian context. My name, as Dr. Ray, through a very kind introduction, pointed out my background. I have a joint appointment in 3 departments at IIT Jodhpur, and I also come from an interdisciplinary background. As you can see, the talk title is mediated by 2 logos. One of them is IIT Jodhpur, where I teach and research, and DHARTI, which is Digital Humanities Alliance for Research and Teaching Innovations. I'm very fortunate right now to be part of India's first master's and PhD program in digital humanities at IIT Jodhpur, which I'll talk about towards the end of the presentation. And I'm equally fortunate to be a founding member of India's first DH Collective. So I'm going to start off a little bit about my own journey with DH in India. So in 2018, as Dr. Ray mentioned, we were then called the Digital Humanities Alliance of India. We co-organized a conference at IIM Indore in collaboration with IIT Indore. And while we were surprised, we did not expect a lot of submissions. We were surprised to have more than 80 submissions. And out of that, there were participation from 15 Indian states and 5 countries. And this organization, Digital Humanities Alliance of India, started in 2016 and got renamed to Dharti in 2018. As you can see, we were also very fortunate to organize India's first Twitter conference on digital humanities in January 2020 with Professor Arjun Ghosh from IIT Delhi, who in fact led this, who's a colleague and a friend who in fact led this initiative on Dharti's behalf. And there's multiple other colleagues who work with me in Dharti. We also this year over the pandemic, because our outreach was limited, as you can understand, we have presence all over social media. We are on WhatsApp, YouTube, as well as Slack and Facebook. Last year, because our public outreach was limited and DH is nothing without public outreach, we started a YouTube series called Dharti Speaks, which was these 2 talks that were held last year. And we have very exciting news in terms of the second Dharti conference that's coming out in 2022. I'll put the link in the chat box before I end the talk. And this is just this year's CFP, which is on our website, which is dh30.in. So it's called Digital Divides, Discontents, Debates, and Discussions. So we don't run away from we are not a techno-positivist DH body. We don't believe that technology solves all problems. And in fact, we believe that as digital humanists, we need to have a far more critical cultural take on digitality, right? So without further ado, I'm just going to go into what the agenda for today's talk is. So on the left-hand side, you can see sort of 2 sort of frivolous pictures. One of them is from Pulp Fiction, one of the favorite memes of digital humanities, which says, "Say digital humanities one more goddamn time." And on the bottom is "Naam to suna hi hoga." So these are the sort of 2 schools in humanities, or in fact social sciences largely. One school which is already gung-ho about digital humanities, and the other school which says, right, we are tired of this word. What does it mean? What does it even mean? So my attempt today is going to be quite simple, sort of demystify this overall aura around digital humanities, to tell you that there is no aura, right? So there is no aura. There's nothing spectacular. It's very quotidian in its everyday manifestations, because digitality is very quotidian in our everyday lives. So I think that's something that I hope to have a conversation on with today. So these are the basic sort of pointers or overheads for today's conversation. So I start out with what is humanistic inquiry, what is DH, or why should you care? I then move on to context and methodologies, humanistic data, and DH. Then I move on to who is a digital humanist. Then we talk about Indian DH and its challenges, and then we articulate a path forward. So I would also like to place or emphasize upfront that the affordance of Google Meet as a platform doesn't allow me to see the screen except my own PowerPoint slides as I talk. So in case I lose connection, I request Professor Chakraborty to give me a call, because that happens very often. And in case there's a burning question that you cannot wait till the end of the talk which is absolutely fine, just put it in the chat box or stop me, interrupt me. I would be more than happy to take that question in. And thank you so much again to all colleagues, faculty colleagues, and students who've joined us today. I hope this will be an engaging conversation. Right. So starting off, what is humanistic inquiry? Right. So let's talk about this. What do the humanities do? This is something that comes in our conversations very often. Humanities are about what is to be human, understanding others in languages, histories, culture. They foster social justice, equality, reveal how people have tried to make a world more moral, spiritual, and intellectual in their conversations. Humanities teach us to deal critically and logically with subjective, complex, imperfect information. So chaotic, messy, subjective data. This is about what the humanities are about, and teach us to weigh evidence skeptically and consider more than one side of every question. I think this is common to everyone, all of my colleagues, faculty, and students. I think we are all aware of this. But a key question that comes up is, how is this operationalized, right? How is this implemented? How is this operationalized, right? So that's something I want to begin today with, is that a key aspect of humanistic inquiry is the development of cultural logic. What do we mean by cultural logic? Cultural logic is the process of people collectively using effectively identical assumptions in interpreting each other's actions, and this is known as cultural logic. Now, how is this done? Right? This is done through an analysis of what? Analysis of human artifacts, actions, or ideas that have urgent meaning for us in the present. And please sort of mark the words that I've put out in red: human artifacts, urgent, present. Essentially, humanistic inquiry is predicated or leveraged on human artifacts that have urgent meaning for us in the present. So let's look at some human artifacts that have had urgent meanings for us in their present context, right? In their presence, right? So there are three in front of you right now. One of them is the 6th pillar edicts of Ashoka from 238 BC in Brahmi. The next is the Sogara copperplate inscription, which is 3rd century BC. And the last one, which I put on screen here, and these are just typical representations, they are not inclusive of all. This is the Kashmiri manuscript on birch bark from the 17th century. Right. So if I was in an open conference room at this point of time, I would have requested you to please raise your hands and tell me what is the one word that connects all these three artifacts, right? I'm also a media studies scholar, so I see the overlaps between media studies and digital humanities as integral to these conversations. So because today we don't have that opportunity, I'm going to answer my own question myself. So these are all materialities enabling humanistic inquiry, also known as documents. So again, materialities enabling humanistic inquiry, also known as documents. I'm sure going around the room, there'll be some students, some colleagues who like documents. So can I call a pillar edict a document, or a copperplate inscription a document, right? So that's a fair question. And I think that requires us to interrogate the word document. So for that, I go to this fabulous book, which came out a couple of years ago from Lisa Gettelman. It's called Paper Knowledge Toward a Media History of Documents, where she does trace the word document to its Latin root, which goes to docere, to teach or show. So any object, once it is framed, becomes a document. This is a very interesting word, right? Framed, right? So there is an ontological and epistemic understanding to document. There is the being of a document and the epistemic or the knowledge setting within which that document is framed, right? So documents are integral to the ways people think, as well as to the social order that they inhabit, and are tied to specific settings. So these specific settings actually frame these dossiers, which allow us to teach or show. So any object in a specific setting can become a document, right? So as you know, in a classroom, we use different pedagogical tools, and whoever would have thought that a mobile phone would one day become a document, as we have seen for the last 1.5 years, with its obvious challenges. We'll go into that later. So very interestingly, documents therefore have existed longer than books, paper, printing, or the public sphere even. And as you might know right now, all documents are essentially electronic devices. So in a sense, anything that allows us to teach or show through a specific setting is a document, which means all the three artifacts that I showed you in the previous slide are all documents. However, then there's a question I'm sure that comes across in your mind, that why is the signifier document, why is the signified of document always paper? Well, that we have to grant a privilege to this gentleman called Gutenberg and his printing press, which is a very new technology, by the way. It's not even 600 years old. So since the rise of this technology, the book is a technology, make no mistake, right? The book is a piece of technology. And since the rise of Gutenberg's printing press, print-born assumptions have become absolutely central to the humanities and social sciences, especially the humanities. And the close reading of the book has been understood as the only methodology in the humanities. Now, this is a very interesting question I keep asking myself. I asked myself when I was an undergraduate student, and I still keep querying, right? So do we have any methodology in the humanities, right? And in the literary studies, especially because we are a literary studies department today, of course we do. Close reading is a methodology, right? And we often forget that. But what I'm about to show you for the next few slides in the next few minutes, or for the next half an hour or so, is that close reading is not the only methodology of the humanities. So basically, print-born assumptions that come with the Gutenberg and printing press, like close reading, which is a print-born assumptions, are entwined with our social, political, economic, and especially academic structures in the humanities, right? So this is also true for current technological artifacts which try to remediate the book. For example, if you have a Kindle, there's a Kindle paper, right? Because the normative understanding of reading is a book. So therefore, Kindle tries to normatively remediate a book which becomes paper. But we rarely even read books the same way. So here I'm borrowing from the fabulous essay by Matthew Kirschenbaum from 2014, which is called The Remaking of Writing, where Kirschenbaum says that we don't even read the same way. For example, if there's a really exciting, in our times, it used to be sort of, Jeffrey Archer, Pulp Fiction, or maybe even Harry Potter. We read that cover to cover. But when we are reading maybe textbooks, we read excerpts or selections. When we go to a magazine stall, we are grazing or browsing magazines to understand what catches our fancy. When we go maybe to a conference abstract, we skim and scan to see which part of that abstract really, which are the panels which we really want to go in. There's also speed reading. For example, if you're driving and you need to see a sign on the right, you quickly go through it. That's speed reading. And finally, I don't think a lot of the students here might remember this, but this is called reference or lookup, right? So the college I went to, and many of your professors, I think, went to, in those colleges, we had what we call catalog libraries. So we were not physically allowed to touch the books. We had to go through reference cards. We picked out reference cards. We gave out requisition slips, and then the book came to us, right? So on the left-hand side of your screen is Jefferson's revolving table. And this is an apocryphal story that Jefferson actually had 5 to 6 books open at the same time. So he was in fact the first distant reader, which I think I'll go into later. What is distant reading? Okay, so essentially print-born assumptions like close reading are entwined with the printing press, but we don't even read the same way. That's a key idea that I want to sort of emphasize here, which takes us to this idea that documents does not equal books, and documents are essentially materialities enabling humanistic inquiry. And very importantly, humanistic inquiry is not the history of only close reading the book or print culture. I have no grief or I have no fight with close reading. Everyone loves close reading. As a former lapsed literary scholar, I also love close reading, but that is not the only form of humanistic inquiry. So why do I say that, right? So for that, let's look at this. So this is basically, this is a 2019 data set. This is from Statista, which is a statistics-based portal. So for example, there are about 50 to 60 million books in the world right now, which includes the Library of Congress, the British Library, the Chinese Library. But there are 50 to 60 million, and there are in comparison 1.72 billion websites as of 2019. So that's 2 years ago. Take the COVID crisis, that number would have gone up to 1.8 or 1.9 billion. So now the question comes in, are we so arrogant to say that these websites and digital web spaces are not sites for humanistic inquiry? Then we are, I think, second guessing ourselves as humanists, because these digital platforms, digital websites, places, spaces are as much a site for humanistic inquiry as are printed books, printed literature, manuscripts, stone inscriptions, everything, right? So then a quick question that comes to me every time, are you then saying that this is the death of traditional humanistic inquiry only through close reading? So are you saying this is the death of close reading? Not at all, never, right? But I would like to acknowledge, and I think there needs to be a collective acknowledgement, that knowledge networks. What is a book? A book is part of a knowledge network, right? If epistemology is how we know what we know, a book is essentially only a small part of that epistemic structure. So we need to acknowledge that knowledge networks do not begin or end with the printing press. And we also need to acknowledge that digital platforms have become the curators of public discourse, and we must examine the roles they aim to play and the terms by which they hope to be judged. So not only digital platforms as objects of inquiry, but in fact, their very process of creation is also a site of inquiry, right? So it's just not a method or an object, it's both. And we also need to self-critically understand both. If you are confused or you have questions, I'll be breaking it down in more granular terms. But this graphic really helps you understand how our lives are mediated, especially in a post-pandemic, with the privileges of having a steady net connection, which not all of us have, which we are also going to talk about. But at least for many of us and most of us here, our collaboration, networks, publishing, sharing, messaging, discussing are all mediated by digital platforms. And the essay I'm pulling here from Gillespie is called The Politics of Platform. It's a 2010 essay, which I would strongly recommend to any colleagues or students who are interested to talk about the politics of digital platforms. So now we come to that very key question. What is DH, or why should you care? I just want to take a quick check. I hope I'm audible and visible to everyone. If someone just could give me an yes.
Absolutely. Carry on.
Oh, thank you. So what is DH, or why should you care? So that's the key question, isn't it? So digital humanities is the humanities in and for a digital age. I think a lot of you have heard this multiple times. The digital humanities is a term that's quite recent, by the way. Digital humanities is a 2010 term by the MLA president at that point of time, William Pennebaker, who found out this word digital humanities more as a search on Google. And it sounded like a tactically convenient term for Anglo-American DH departments or Anglo-American English departments. There's a fabulous essay by Matthew Gold, I think, which is called What is DH and What is it doing in English departments? And that's something that we can discuss a little later. But what we essentially started out was called humanities computing. So computing as the humanities, and it has a long history. So digital humanities is not at all new at all, and it is a very long history, especially this graphic, which comes from Jeffrey Rockwell, who's a scholar of DH and philosophy at University of Alberta. He actually manages to visualize how the intersections of computing with what are considered traditionally humanities and social sciences disciplines is shown here. So for example, I just talk of a few here. For example, computing and political science, the intersections are intellectual property, cyber politics. With history, there's philosophy and history of science and technology. With English, there's bibliography and editorial studies. Of course, between English and media studies, there's that small sort of space where literary theory, cultural studies, game studies also comes in with computing, with hypertext theory. You have art, you have computer-assisted language learning, which is called computational linguistics, which India actually has a very long legacy of, and philosophy with philosophy of mathematics, linguistic philosophy, right? So if this has got you more confused, that's great. Because in the DH Manifesto 2.0, Jeffrey Schnapp and Pressner, they talk about DH as a collective signaler, signifying a wide array of convergent practices. Now, what does that mean, right? A wide array of convergent practices means that we are not trying to define the specificities of that word digital plus humanities. So it's not digital plus humanities. It's not digital mediated by humanities or humanities mediated by digitality, right? It's an ontological space which is completely new in its own. So the digitality is not only a new way of looking at digital objects, but of reimagining the humanities as a whole, right? So that's the key idea. But I like to have simple examples or simple definitions. There's an entire series called Debates in Digital Humanities, which is getting next edition this year, where I also have an essay coming out from University of Minnesota Press, where you will have this entire school of thought on debating the definitions of digital humanities. Please feel free. It's an open source edition online. Go ahead, have a look at it. The Blackwell Companion to Digital Humanities is also a very, very good book to look at. I like the definition, which is from Elijah Meeks. He was a digital humanities librarian at Stanford. I think now he's at Netflix. So Elijah Meeks uses a very simple definition. He says, bringing digital tools, objects, and techniques to bear on traditional humanities scholarship. So the reason I operationalize this definition, as you will get to know later in my talk, is because I use this definition to operationalize who is a digital humanist. Because that question is less talked about who is a digital humanist. So please have this in mind. Digital tools, objects, and techniques to bear on traditional humanities scholarship, right? So digital humanities needs to contend with data in or for at least 3 types of platforms. Now, don't get scared when you hear the word data, please, right? There's nothing scary about the word data. Data and capta, which are the two sort of data is given and capta is taken. These are sort of words that we need to talk about more often in the humanities. There's nothing, data doesn't belong to the sciences only. So that's something we hope to sort of, again, demystify today. So digital humanities needs to contend with data in or for at least 3 types of platforms. Platforms that used to use prosume data. Prosume is a word that's used by the media theorist Henry Jenkins. So produce and consume. So Jenkins has this framework called convergence culture, where he says we are all producers and consumers at the same time. And this is very easy for the millennials and Generation Z to understand. You are continuously producing content on Facebook as well as consuming content. So both the production and the consumption of content on social media is from us. So this is called UGC, user generated content. Then we have platforms that we use to analyze data. This is data mining, text mining, like Voyant, like Orange, which obviously, some of you might know. If you don't, that's also great. That's not a problem. And then fundamentally, there's also platforms that we archive or publish in, like open source, open access, which is one of the major conversations in digital humanities. How can we make knowledge more accessible and retrievable, right? These are the two main points about the last one, about archiving and publishing, accessibility and retrievability, right? So we'll come to that. And I'm trying to sort of condense a 20-session course into one lecture, but I'm happy to take this up in questions. Right. So again, there's always, as literary scholars, I think, and humanities scholars, we love periodization. So it's interesting to understand the periods of digital humanities, while this is again an oversimplification. But digital humanities, at least in the Anglo-American world, again, let me emphasize the word Anglo-American, because Anglo-American digital humanities is not Indian digital humanities, which looks very different. So at least in the Anglo-American world, the first wave of digital humanities started out with this gentleman who was a priest called Father Robert Busa, who tied up with Thomas Watson at IBM to create a concordance of St. Thomas of Aquinas's work, right? So this was a book called, and so this was, index cards being made, and a lot of people don't talk about, or only talk about Robert Busa and Thomas Watson, but a lot of people don't talk about the women data entry operators who actually created this index cards. So there's a large problematic history of technology and gender, which is also part of DH, which hopefully we'll get time to talk about. So with the rise of this kind of digitization projects that Roberto Busa can arguably be understood to be the initiator of, we had started having database search and retrieval, which started out, one of the canonical projects is Digital Dun, the online variorum. And of course, if you know of Bichitra, which we'll talk about a little later, Digital Dun becomes the first online variorum with the Cervantes project. Then we have, as these kind of textual, or how would I say, printed objects go online, we also needed to have encoding structures, right? How do you encode a text? So for example, as a literary scholar, you know that when you look at a text, marginalia is very important for you. How do you make notes? Or when you look at an old book, for example, book history is intrinsically connected with digital humanities. But how do you then digitize that? Is there a way to digitize without losing out the marginalia? That is where something like TEI came in, which is called Text Encoding Initiative, that allowed you to create structures or structures in existing computational platforms so that everything on a page could be digitized, right? But with that, there's another thing that comes in, which is metadata. What is metadata? Very simply put, metadata is data about data, right? Metadata is data about data. And if you think metadata only exists in large scale, multi-million-dollar, lakhs of crores of money in a funding project, no. Metadata can begin on your very humble laptop with a simple Excel sheet. In fact, I strongly recommend that all metadata begins at an Excel sheet level. Okay, so this is the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative, which creates a basic platform, a global understanding of how metadata can be uniformly understood across countries, across contexts, right? So this was understood as the first quantitative wave of digital humanities. While I don't completely agree with the categorization, but this is how it's understood in the Anglo-American DH world. And then comes the second qualitative wave. So what happens with the rise of these kind of entire variorums and entire collections put online is that we have an entire set of born digital artifacts, right? So this is electronic literature as well. Electronic literature, as some of you might know and be interested in, electronic literature, ELO, refers to works with important literary aspects that take advantage of the capabilities and context provided by the standalone or network computer. So these are works that do not have any print paradigm to them. They're all born digital works. So these kind of works, you needed to have new digital toolkits to understand and even analyze them. This led to the rise of new disciplinary paradigms. In a longer lecture, I could have shown you some examples, which is why you might see it linked here. So Voyant, for example, is a very simple text mining software. So one of the things, especially for students, if you're interested in doing DH work or trying to understand text analysis, just tonight after my lecture gets done, go online and search up Voyant tools. This was created by two academics, Dr. Stephen Sinclair and Dr. Jeffrey Rockwell. Dr. Sinclair very sadly passed away last year, but it's a fantastic open source platform to analyze and understand literary text, right? So do a distant reading, which I'll come to. So now we come to the context and methodologies for humanistic data and DH. So I'm doing okay on time, I think. So I think I'll take a little bit of time to explicate this. So humanistic data, what is it, right? When we hear the word data, as I said, as humanists, and this is true for me as well, maybe 15 years ago, if I heard the word data, and I'm actually a lapsed engineer as well. I did engineering for a few months before shifting to literary studies, then going to social sciences, and then finally ending up with communication and cultural studies. But yeah, so we'll go into that later. But humanistic data, what is it? So here I am borrowing from the work of Katherine Hayles and Jessica Pressman, who write a fabulous book called Comparative Textual Media. This is also available open source from the MIT Press. If you are interested, as you can see from the sort of small subtitle, Transforming the Humanities in the Post-Print Era. It's a very, very seminal work in this field. So many humanists hear data and they assume they don't have it, but humanities data can take many forms, including images, music, poetry, short stories, and more. And this is from Miriam Posner, who says, humanists believe that the scholar's own subject position is inextricably linked to the scholarship she produces. So this is very interesting. That when, as a humanities scholar, we are always self-reflexively questioning ourselves. Our research questions, which is fundamentally the most important thing for anyone in any discipline. Our research question in the humanities has a very interesting self-reflexivity built in. What does self-reflexivity mean? It means that we always acknowledge our own subjectivity when we acknowledge our research question. So what does that mean? It means that in a post-print humanistic world, our analysis should awaken to the importance of media-specific analysis, recognizing that all texts, documents, texts in the broader sense, are instantiated, and that the nature of the medium in which they're instantiated matters, which means if humanistic inquiry is instantiated in digital binary code in 0 and 1, as a humanist, it's my responsibility, in fact, an ethical responsibility to actually interrogate those spaces as well as those numbers and terms. So this is from a fabulous essay by Katherine Hayles called Print is Flat and Code is Deep. Again, available free and open source, so please go ahead and check that out. Right. Now, so then if you think that digital humanities and distant reading or using quantitative methods to read literature are a very new thing, you are absolutely mistaken. It started out in the early 19th century with something called stylometry. So stylometry, you can see examples as early as 1887 in T.C. Mendelhall's publication, I think in Science, which was the characteristic word curves of composition, which tried to understand what are the specific words that Mark Twain uses versus Charles Dickens. So each author had their specific word curves. So stylometry is in fact the first act of distant reading. But coming to the 20th century, the word distant reading was introduced into the lexicon or reintroduced into the lexicon by a gentleman called Franco Moretti, who is at the Stanford Literary Lab, who writes this essay in the New Left Review in 2011 called Network Theory and Thought Analysis. So what does Franco Moretti do? So he takes up Hamlet and the murder of Gonzago and decides that he's going to do a social network analysis of that scene. So he tries to find out who are the key characters who become the nodes, and then he tries to find out who are the key characters having a conversation with to understand the protagonist. Surprise, surprise, everyone has a conversation with Hamlet, so he's the protagonist. Of course, like when you write an essay like this, you are meant to have a lot of critique. So all of Franco Moretti's friends and came told me, oh great, Dr. Moretti, you just told us what we have known for the last 400 years, that Hamlet is the key character in Hamlet, right? So Moretti's response was beautiful. So Moretti said that the goal, and this is what Kirschenbaum sort of paraphrases later on, that the goal is not to use the machine to supplant the judgment and expertise of a human expert who has spent a lifetime reading Dickinson, but rather to see if the machine classifications can provoke new insights amongst a body of familiar text, right? So at this moment, if I have, let me see whether I can do that. I'll just stop sharing and show you a quick video to see how this provoke new insights can be shown, and we'll come back, right? So let me see whether I can quickly open out this video for you. Right. So I'm trying to share a tab. In case you're not able to hear or see the tab, let me know.
In 2 minutes?
Is this audible and visible? Yes, no?
Yes,
Perfect.
yes, sir.
Okay, great.
Yes, yes.
Most people think historians spend all their time in the library reading books, and you wouldn't be far off. But recently, the library has gotten too big, way too big, and it's getting bigger at an alarming rate. That's because billions of records have been digitized and are now online. Historians are faced with far more material than they could ever hope to read in a lifetime, or even 100 lifetimes. My research looks at a pretty typical historical question. How were Irish immigrants to London, England treated at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution? But instead of heading to the library, I'm heading to my computer to apply some of the best tricks of computer science to the task, namely distant reading. Distant reading basically means figuring out what something says without actually reading it. It's the type of classifying that Google does to help you find a recipe for an apple pie. Google hasn't read those web pages. Instead, they've created a computer program that does it for them. I'm doing the same thing, but instead of focusing on pies, I'm asking questions like, which documents refer to Irish people? Like Google, I've developed a set of computerized tests to determine if a document is relevant or if it's not. That automation is crucial when you're dealing with databases containing hundreds
Yeah, suddenly got gone silent.
It stopped.
And
Dibu, you're
you
muted.
muted yourself. Divyajit. Yeah.
That's probably.
Yeah, sorry. I'll just try once again. I think there was a problem with the. Okay, just let me try once again.
That automation is crucial when you're dealing with databases containing hundreds of millions of words of text. But finding relevant material is all we can do in the age of the internet. Computers have also allowed me to measure aspects of 19th century life in which the Irish experience differed from that of a typical Londoner. For example, I can tell you that an Irish person was roughly 4 times more likely than an English counterpart to appear in a London court on trial for his or her life. There's no way we would ever have found that out without distant reading. We live in a world in which information is overabundant, and managing it effectively can mean the difference between finding what you're after and getting lost in a jungle of data. There's too much to read out there, so it's time we found another way to do it. My name is Adam Crimble. I'm a student at King's College London in the United Kingdom, and the title of my thesis is Understanding the London Irish Immigrant Experience Through Large-Scale Textual Analysis, 1801 to 1820.
So before I head back to my PowerPoint, I just want to mention something. So Adam Crimble runs a very innovative DH website called Programming Historian. I'll put that link in your chat box very often. But let me add something, and I've been fortunate to have a conversation with Adam recently. So let me just also add something that there's something I disagree with Adam on this one, right? So the question is not whether you have to uncritically apply distant reading to everything. It all depends on your research question. For example, for Adam's research question, he needed to actually look at billions or millions of texts. So for that, he chose distant reading. In your case, if your research question requires you to only look at 4 texts, right? So what you essentially do when you have a question, like for example, if you want to find out the role of the Bengali immigrant in Delhi during the 20th century, right? And you choose 4 books or 4 literary texts to look at. And don't worry, I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint, but you want to make this aspect very clear that if you choose to look at 4 texts, what you're essentially doing is an act of sampling. And this social scientists know very well that you have a population of texts, but you choose 4 texts as the sample which is representative of that population, right? And we don't use the word sampling in literary studies, but that's exactly what we do. We choose 4 texts out of a population, and we do it because as trained literary scholars, we do something called purposive sampling. Purposive sampling is where the judgment of the expert, in this case the humanities researcher, is used to choose a certain sample from a population. So now let me go back to my PowerPoint again. And unfortunately, this is the only video I have time for. I do have lots to show you, but maybe not today. You're welcome to get in touch with me later. Right. So I hope my screen is visible again. Can you give me a quick yes?
Yeah. Carry on.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
Right. So then now that we have looked at textual data, there's of course also called non-textual data. Non-textual data, and there are sort of two people who are understood to be the big names in DH methodologies, which is on one hand is Franco Moretti and the other hand is Lev Manovich. And if you're a new media or a cultural studies scholar, you would know Lev Manovich because of his software studies initiative which he runs. So Lev Manovich started something called cultural analytics, which is only to deal with non-textual data, which is defined as a wide range of formats, which encompasses everything but language-based text. So there's a link here, which I'll share later with colleagues here. Today, we don't have time to look at it. So what are the methods for analyzing and coding? So for example, in social sciences, we have qualitative coding. So we have content analysis, document analysis, compositional interpretation, musical analysis, cultural studies, visual sociology, visual anthropology, semiotic analysis, iconography, discourse analysis, visual social semiotics, and multimodal research. These are all ways of understanding non-textual data. And how do we understand non-textual data in the digital world? That's a challenge, but fear not, you have enough tools to do that. For example, you can ask me, how do we frame a research question about non-textual data on YouTube? So for example, there's a lot of mukbang videos on YouTube, right? Which is about some people eating something. And nowadays there's reaction videos to mukbang videos. But as a humanities scholar, you must be getting very, very intrigued, right? What do they say about both the producers of these videos as well as the ecosystem in which these videos exist? The reaction to reaction videos, right? There's a lot of memes going around this right now. So for example, a user-generated music video on YouTube can provide insight into how the creators of the video portray themselves, their surroundings, and the music. The viewers' comments on the video can help researchers understand the culture surrounding the video. So as you can understand, your research question, if your research question is about how do reaction videos to Kapil Sharma shows and the inherent sexism in these shows get mediated in YouTube, you have that research question in your mind and you want to see it through the YouTube comments. Of course, you cannot manually scrape all the YouTube data. You have to use a text scraper, right? So that tool is available for you. So at no point of time are we taking away from your skills as a humanist, which is the enabling of interpretive cultures of conversation. That is never being taken away. Only that now that you're dealing with a different medium, because the medium has changed, going back to my previous slide, the medium in which humanistic inquiry is instantiated has changed. Therefore, we need new methodologies, new paradigms to understand. Okay. So now I'm coming towards the end of my talk. I want to sort of go into this idea of who is a digital humanist. This is a question for which I'll take you back to my slide where I talked about, so digital tools, objects, and techniques to bear on traditional humanities scholarship. So I want to take you here. Just keep that definition in mind, bringing digital tools, objects, and techniques to bear on traditional humanities scholarship. So how does then the digital humanist look like? So for one of the three paradigms which I am going to discuss today, the first one is the computational humanist in no particular order. So the computational humanist for whom computational technology has become the very condition of possibility required in order to think about the many questions raised in the humanities today. So if you ask for an example, my recent publication published in Health Promotion International, which is an Oxford publication, actually topic modeled all the tweets from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare during the COVID crisis to understand the impact of social media publicity during the COVID crisis, right? So as you can understand, my research question has as its core the computational platform of Twitter. So I cannot do without Twitter or data scraping because my question is intrinsically built there. So in my role there, at least in that paper, I'm a computational humanist. Who could be the next person? The next person, so this is a person who uses digital techniques, right? Digital techniques to answer the research question, which is the computational humanist. The next person would be who looks at digital objects. The multimodal scholar explores new forms of literacy that includes authoring and analyzing visual, oral, dynamic, and interactive media in a more immersive and sensory-rich space. So for a literary scholar, this is very easy to understand. Imagine from text, you now look at video games. So now you've become a multimodal scholar. So now you're looking at digital objects. The last, but definitely not the least, is the digital tools. Is the digital archivist who purposefully selects online groupings of digital copies of non-digital original materials located in different physical repositories in order to support a scholarly goal. So the digital archivist or the digital humanist is this person who creates a collection for a specific scholarly or academic goal. So digital techniques would be the computational humanist, the digital objects with the multimodal scholar, and digital tools with the digital archivist. Now, as you can see in this visualization, I have deliberately chosen to show them in a circle, which means none of these roles exist in silos, but they're always in conversation with each other. For example, the archive of Twitter tweets that I've pulled from Twitter, I had pulled about 30 to 40,000 tweets, right? If I now look at the create an archive of that, and then if I ask a multimodal scholar to analyze the memes and pictures in those tweets, it means that every digital humanist is always already, to use a philosophical term, always already inhabiting all these three spaces together, right? So keep that in mind, that they are not silos, they are always collaborative. Digital humanists are collaborative, and in fact question this myth of the humanities scholar as this isolated person who sits in a corner of the room or a library and just works on his or her own, because humanistic inquiry is also a very collaborative thing. It's not an isolationist endeavor, which I think is also a very Anglo-American thing to talk about, right? So as I end, I think it's also very important to talk about the challenges of doing Indian DH, which is something that I focus on, and I regularly sort of try to question the epistemic frameworks of Anglo-American DH. So one of the major problems with digital humanities scholarship from the West is they imagine India doesn't have DH. Well, India has had DH for a very long time. So I'll give you two examples. On the left of your screen on the top is a project called Project Madurai, which is a digitization of ancient Tamil texts, which started in the early 90s with ASCII being remade into TASCII. So Tamil becoming a part of the ASCII language. So Project Madurai was started by a group of ad hoc scholars, independent practitioners, who just decided that this was very, very important. And on the right-hand side of your screen, at the right corner, is Bichitra, which is an online variorum of Tagore's works, which started from with Jadavpur University, a project of the School of Culture, Texts and Records, a very institutional production where Jadavpur University's Humanities School tied up with their engineering, funded by the Ministry of Culture, and they produced this massive variorum and absolutely pioneering work in Indian DH. But these two works, I give you an example, just to tell you that the spectrum of Indian DH is such that on one hand, you have ad hoc collaborative projects like Project Madurai, which have no institutional presence per se, and something like Bichitra, which is deeply tied to the institutional privileges that come with a Jadavpur University or an IIT or an IIM or even a Zakir Hussain College, which is a Delhi University college, right? So even smaller places have been doing DH for a long time. Examples include the Ulor Digital Archives, the data from French Institute of Pondicherry, National Institute Digital Library of India, which is also part of the open access argument, Swatantra Malayalam Computing, Janastu's work with open source code, and I'm happy to give these links to the organizers if they feel it's important for people to look over, right? So this basically, the takeaway from this slide is Indian DH is not one thing, okay? It's many things. So what are the challenges then? So this was the title, in fact, of our first, subtitle of our first Dharti conference in 2018. It was Contestations, Connections and Collaboration. So what did we say that these problems were? Firstly, OCR or optical character recognition software capable of digitizing printed Indic text with high levels of accuracy is still elusive. It's available. Lots of people are working on it, but Latinate text is still the de facto go-to place for digitization. So for Devanagari, for other Tamil, Malayalam, it's very challenging still. It's happening. So Transcribers is a software that is allowing Devanagari to be transcribed. There's also HTR, handwriting text recognition, which is also coming in right now. Secondly, some of the electronic literature that Sneha and Chatterjee talk about. In India, there's a rise of electronic literature, but in most cases, they're not born digital, but are digital versions that have existed in earlier media, right? So they're not really born digital per se. very importantly, DH has only recently started to consider the intersectional implications of technology, race, gender, sexuality, and interrogating the often masculinist ideologies of techno-positivism, right? What I started out this lecture with, that this idea that technology will solve everything. This kind of techno-positivism that comes from a neoliberal academic space, or maybe it's a legacy from colonial times as well. If you want to look at Gyan Prakash's work, which is a fabulous work on this kind of techno-positivist imaginary coming in from colonial times. And very importantly, India's pernicious colonial history has a DIFM, so do it for me, right? Attitude of British colonial imperialists, which is further complicated by India's caste politics. So upper caste Hindu men don't like using their hands, right? So that's why a lot of them, which is why a very funny story, and this I'll put on my management teacher hat here. So this company called IKEA, which is a Swedish giant, which is all over the world known for its DIY furniture, do it yourself. IKEA in India was struggling in its first few months because no one was willing to do it for yourself. So they had to actually tie up with Pepperfry and local furniture makers to actually make those furnitures, right? So this idea of making as not intellectual or humanities oriented is also a major drawback for the sort of absorption or acceptance of digital humanities in traditional humanities schools and colleges, right? So what is the path forward, right? So the theory and praxis for a decolonized DH, and I purposely use the word decolonized because decolonized, and I'm reflecting on the word of Fanon and Minolo here, where decolonial is much more material as opposed to post-colonial, which is much more cultural in its manifestations. So some provocations. I don't have answers, I have provocations. So these provocations are, how important is it for Indian humanities researchers, pedagogues, and practitioners to self-identify as digital humanists, to participate and contribute in the global project of digital humanities, right? So basically the question is, do I have to call myself a digital humanist to be a digital humanities scholar, or can I do my own thing and still be taken in the overall global space of digital humanities? So which leads to the second question, or can digital humanities with its specificities and limitations, such as the technological divide, lack of a linguistic unifier, unequal educational structures, develop a new theory and decolonize praxis for global DH? And then the obvious question is, what would be the ontology of institutions, infrastructures, and interstices required for a decolonized episteme of DH? And finally, can hacking and yakking exist in a provocative dialectical tension? So don't worry, I'm not going to go into the Marxist analysis of dialectical materialism, but simply to talk about what is a dialectical tension and what is hacking and yakking. So in the West, there is this big understanding that to know DH, you must code, and and there's other group of people who feel that no, DH is all about the theoretical underpinnings of technology. So in India, it doesn't work that way. We are doing things simultaneously at the same time, and therefore we don't need to do one or the other. Hacking and yakking can exist in a productive dialectical tension. I'll give you an example. So this is an example I'm very fond of. This is Dr. Sugata Mitra, who's known apocryphally for what is called the hole in the wall experiment. So a quick background to this. Dr. Sugata Mitra was at that point of time, this is early 1990s, around 1998. He was working around the Kalkaji area, and I know there's lots of slums in the Kalkaji area. I don't like the word particularly, but in this particular piece, he identifies these as slums. And so Dr. Sugata Mitra went into one of these so-called slum areas, and he created a literal hole in the wall and put in a computer. Like most privileged people, his understanding was that people would probably, these young kids, would probably take away the computer and run away with all the parts. So 7 days later, when Dr. Sugata Mitra goes back, he sees that the kids are not only playing with the installed software on this computer, but they've in fact found a new vocabulary. So they describe the computer in their own terms, often coining words to indicate what they saw on screen. For instance, the children's word for the hourglass symbol that appears when the program is thinking was Damru, the name of a small wooden drum shaped like an hourglass, that is a symbol of the Hindu god Shiva. The mouse cursor was called Sui, a Hindi word for needle, or Tir, which means arrow, which I hope you now realize that not only are we using technology in our own ways, we are also creating a new vocabulary for technology. So we don't need the vocabulary of the Anglo-American DH or their ways of functioning on the technology, because as you can see from this example, we are very capable of developing our own. So this is now called the minimally invasive experiment, MIE, You can read about it online. There's fabulous lot of case studies. He has a TED talk on this as well. So as I end today, let me talk about then how do I define DH in India. So obviously there's many limitations. There's government and institutional funding. There's intersectional privileges of race, class, gender, caste, technological affordances. These are all that creates a certain social imagery of the humanities and post-colonial spaces, right? So good students don't study humanities apparently. Technically skilled students can't study humanities. All of them are part of how all of them are part of how educational institutions which deal in largely humanities and social sciences are often constrained. And especially now the socio-political environment in a post-COVID world, where we feel very limited because the skill of a humanist of having everyday conversations is being limited. However, don't worry, right? This is actually a very good time for humanists, because as you understand that the problems, the divisions, the debates that are taking place due to this unequal access for digitality is very much a part of the conversation of digital humanities, which should ultimately lead us to a humanistic, anti-hierarchical, non-exclusionary and collaborative signified for the decolonized digital humanities. And how would this arise? So I want to end with some examples of how digital humanities has shaped out in institutions in this country. One of them, of course, is the Center for Digital Humanities in Pune. The other canonical one is the School of Cultural Text and Records at Jadavpur University, which has been running the PG certificate course in editing and publishing for the last 12 years. See how DH is taking very different shapes. And finally, now from 2020, actually, IIT Jodhpur started this program. And I was fortunate to be also part of the curriculum development for this program. And the focus of this program is truly interdisciplinary, where you have management scholars, humanities scholars, computer scientists, all being part of the digital humanities interdisciplinary platform, right? So truly sort of an interdisciplinary conversation. And so I'm going to end today's talk on this particular quote from the Digital Humanities Manifesto, which says that, so let's imagine a new topography, not just disciplinary, but one involving alternative configurations for producing knowledge, open-ended, global in scope, designed to attract new audiences and to establish novel institutional models. Perhaps digital humanities itself becomes a distributed virtual department overlaid on current departments, weaving together shifting archipelagos of researchers from intellectually and geographically diverse disciplines on the basis of overlapping research networks, right? So the hope is lovely. The hope is that digital humanities no longer is a normative space, but a site that allows for these lines of flight, rhizomatic, very Deleuzian, Guattarian lines of flight to come into play. So with that, I will conclude and stop sharing and open out for questions. Thank you so much for being so patient. It's 5:01, so I think I made good time.
Thank you, Dr. Roy, for your fascinating presentation. As a scholar of book history and print cultures myself, and the idea of the materiality here, of course, as far as print cultures was concerned, it was the text, the various versions of it. And here, of course, you talk about the document, the meaning, the way in which it has changed, taking it back to dossier, and of course, the fascinating way forward for a decolonized DH. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful introduction for our students to the world of DH, and I hope some of them will continue to work in the area and at least be interested to, look up DH, what is happening. And this is, as you mentioned, Generation Z, who are learning more from online tools and online websites rather than the physical text. So I think it was fascinating, and thank you so much. Now it is over to Orun Habo and Hemlina, our students, who will be coordinating the question answer session.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr.
If anyone has any questions, it seems like there are a few.
Yes.
Murari
Orun, you
Prasad
can start
asked,
with the first question, and then
yeah.
Hemlina can ask the second question, and so on. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. So the first question is from Mr. Murari Prasad. Can we treat Twitterature, a blend of Twitter and literature, as a component of digital humanities?
Right. Thank you, Ornavo, for moderating. And Murari, if you are in the room, could you clarify what you mean by literature in this context? Murari, if you are in the room. Okay, so I'll take the question up. I don't know what is meant by a blend of Twitter and literature. Anything that's produced on Twitter can arguably be argued. There's Twitter poetry, there's flash fiction. So there's lots of examples of literary or humanistic artistic output on Twitter. So I wanted to actually get a more granular definition of literature from Murari. But I think this component of digital humanities is a very essentializing word. I would definitely say that anywhere where artistic output and something that's subjective, interpretive, comes into conversation with digital platforms would be a conversation piece and a possible site of inquiry, also a site of production for digital humanities scholarship as well as lexicon. So definitely yes.
Thank you, sir. I hope this answers his question. The next question is from Arunav. He asks that digital humanities opens up new methodologies for researchers to refer to so many historical documents and information. But don't you think that it will become a little bit more confusing to navigate through such a cavalcade of information? What if it leads to such an overflow of knowledge that distant reading cannot cut it out anymore? What more methods can we use to filter out the useless information and highlight on the useful info?
Okay.
Over to
Ornavo,
you,
have
sir.
you been to the National Archives?
No, sir.
You must. Then you'll realize there's nothing useless when you look at humanistic knowledge. So this
Yes,
word,
sir.
right? So this word, the confusion is a site of creation. In humanities, there is no place. So the question you've asked is, don't you think it'll become a little more confusing? So the confusion you think is because the data is more, that's your confusion, right? So with the data is more, there's, of course, with the data being more, there's new computational techniques. So that confusion doesn't arise, but my problem is more with the overflow of knowledge part, right? There has always been an overflow of knowledge. Even without computational technologies, there was more knowledge that a human being could handle, right? So this understanding that only with digitality we have an overflow of knowledge is misleading. Okay, so I don't think that's the. So I don't think the answer is that it will become more confusing or there'll be an overflow of knowledge. What I think you want to understand is, with distant reading, does articulating a research question become more difficult? Yes, that could possibly be true. Because of why, I'll tell you. When your research question is possibly looking at a population of 1 million texts as opposed to 100 printed books, your research question could be more challenging, which is absolutely a fair question to me, which is great. So that research question, that means we'll have to understand new ways of understanding humanistic inquiry. So it's a new challenge. And I think this is so exciting for humanities. And if you are updated with the general conversation on humanities right now, which is, we keep saying humanities is dead, there's a crisis in the humanities. So your question actually tells us that there is no crisis in the humanities. There's only new possibilities and sites of production.
Thank you, sir. So let's move on to the next question. The next question is from Mr. Amitosh Chandra. Sir, when we utilize all the data received and generated by sampling and research of multiple fields and sources, we make a data bank digitally and organically. How does a digital humanist authenticate the same to represent the findings as a formal source to an organization or institution?
So I think Amitosh's question is actually on a different register. And I think that's an interesting question because, so I'll put it on a different register, which is that in a traditional humanities academic model, the monograph is understood to be the gold standard. You publish a book and you are understood to have arrived in the world of humanities. But now with the rise of digital archives and collections, institutions are being challenged in their understanding of what is a humanities scholar. Does a humanities scholar only produce books or articles, or does a humanities scholar go into non-normative minority spaces and recover literatures which are not canonical, which have never been recovered? And can that be understood as academic scholarship as well? If I understand Amitosh's question correctly. So Amitosh, that's a very good question. I think neoliberal academic spaces need to understand humanities in a far more broader context. But if you talk about authenticity, I don't think has ever been an issue with the humanities. So authenticity is only an issue when you're trying to find provenance. Provenance is an archival word, which means where you found it. So again, in provenance, provenance is a very archival term. So, for example, if you look at the Bajaj archives and the Godrej archives, which are the two famous corporate archives in India, the same photograph of Gandhiji will have a different provenance. What does it mean? That the particular historical context determines the authenticity of an artifact. So, when you talk about data, the provenance of data is also very important to understand. Where does it come from? Okay. Yes,
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Amito. Thanks for
Thank
the
you,
question.
sir. Thank you, sir. Danish Shahid asks, like, what methods are to be used to study and work with digital objects? How are these affecting the traditional methods of the humanities?
Great question, Danish. I teach an entire class on course on this, so I'm happy to do an offline conversation with you. There are multiple ways, right? So, for example, if you're trying to look at Twitter data, there's different ways of collecting, scraping, analyzing Twitter data. If you're looking, because there's something called APIs, Application Programming Interface. Application Programming Interface are basically the softwares or the programs that allow one software to have a conversation with the other. So Twitter has an open API which allows us to scrape data very easily. Facebook doesn't have an open API, neither does LinkedIn. So there are certain challenges. There are certain platforms where you cannot access data. There are other platforms which are where you can. For example, YouTube, you can scrape data in terms of comments. So I think, again, as the same answer that I gave to Arunavo, I think it's not affecting the traditional method of the humanities. It's allowing us new avenues. So instead of saying that, this is I'm scared, right? I'm scared. So don't feel scared. This is a this is something very exciting. What are we as humanists? We are people who interpret human culture, human artifacts, and we have the opportunity of doing so much more than the printed book right now, right? So, and that has always been the case. Humanistic scholars, as I've shown you, have been interpreting printed books for only the last 600 odd years. We've been doing non-printed artifacts for the longest possible time. So this is not a new thing. Just because we were largely born and raised in a print paradigm, which is why we feel a little constrained. So going out of the print paradigm and not accepting is as the normative might be the first step to do.
Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Danish.
Sweta Sachdeva Jha wanted to ask something.
Thank you, Divyajyoti. I just love the presentation, but I must say I am not a DH person. I am from the English department, and thanks to the English colleagues for arranging this talk. I think it's very important that you're not addressing us, but you're addressing the students. So I'm sure, there was just too much. It was just so exciting to hear you. I think I feel that I wish I was born now, or at least so that I could do all the exciting work that you're doing or what the others can do. So my questions might sound, okay. I think he's got disconnected.
Yeah, he's back now.
Okay. Classic timing. I can't hear you. I think you've muted yourself.
Yeah, sorry, absolutely. To show you the problems with digitality.
Yeah.
And on that note, Professor Jha, I'll also put the Dharti conference link in the chat box for students and colleagues here. And please continue with the question. Sorry. Please.
Wonderful. So I have two questions which probably might be very basic, but this is, like I said, somebody who's by default entered into the DH conversation, because, and the great part of your lecture was that I feel now I am part of the conversation. I used to have these ideas that this is DH, and I was reading something on my own, trying to figure out what the discipline is, because some of the questions actually were DH, but I never realized that I was part of the conversation. So thank you for that. So my two questions, one of them picks up from where you left off, which is where digital history comes in, provenance. So while working on trying to build an archive, which again, from the women's history point of view, is something, so I work in Miranda House, it's a women's college, and we're trying to digitize our collections. So like I said, I walked into DH, did not realize it. One of the questions was provenance. So when we do, again, digital history can mean so many things, but when we are, for instance, trying to understand objects in a material context, one of the issues that we had as trying to be archivists was, when you scan things or use OCR or whatever and put it in the in a kind of, and you come up with metadata also, still when you're trying to explain this in the classroom, how does provenance work, and where exactly, how do you see provenance, when it comes to history, as a discipline which is trying to do something which is partially digital, not completely digital yet? So that's my first question. And the second, again, comes from a practice domain. It's not like I'm not trying to theorize, I'm just trying to understand. So one of the units that a lot of colleges run in University of Delhi is the enabling unit, where we have visually challenged colleagues or colleagues with other physical disabilities. My question comes from the visually challenged colleagues and students, and Miranda has a huge group of those students, is, so when we talk about digital tools for students from the enabling unit, it's usually about, providing them with tools to use things, but it's not. So where can they enter this digital humanities conversation beyond just trying to, make audio files available? Where do our colleagues and classmates from, let's say, PWD categories fit into this digital humanities conversation, and what can that conversation be like? And I'm sure you'll have a lot to tell us on that.
Thank you for those fantastic questions. So one thing, I'll take the first question, because the first question is very close to me. This is something that I personally am very invested in. So which is that because I have a little bit of interest in, I hope I'm audible. Right. So the first question is, ableism and the idea of ableism and digitality are very connected. And ableist discourse is by nature understood to be digital, and digital discourses are understood to be ableist. So one of the ways that we undercut this is through the UDL model, the Universal Design Learning model. Right. Okay. So Universal Design Learning, and I'll put this in your chat box. The first link is one that is in response to your first question, and the second link is in response to your second question. So understanding universal design for learning. So I personally think, this is my take, again, Professor Jha, I don't think this is understood as Anglo-American DH every day, because Anglo-American DH is a very different signified for that term. But for us, for Global South scholars, I think allowing our colleagues who have special needs, who have special access needs, to be part of the discourse through the universal design learning and through digital pedagogy is a very, very important part of where digital humanities becomes appropriated in the Global South space. So again, this is an entirely new field, because as I pointed out, Professor Jha, these intersectional problems of digitality are just about being considered, because if you look back at Kimberly Crenshaw's essay on intersectionality, Patricia Hill Collins's work, so these are questions that are very new to digital humanities and digitality. So there's so much to do on this. Unfortunately, not enough is being done, is all my response is going to be. I think there's so much to talk about. And in question to the first one, that's such a great question you asked. So the essay I've put in your chat box is by an archivist called Kate Thimer. So Kate Thimer has this essay in the Journal for Digital Humanities called The Archives in Context and As Context. So she says that she's an archivist who's a tourist in the land of digital humanities.
Oh, wonderful.
And so she doesn't actually agree with the definitions of digital humanists archives and the archivist archives, right? So
Right.
GLAM is Galleries, Lives, Archives, and Museums. Thank you for pointing that out. I'm sorry I missed that. Okay, sorry. So, Kate Themer says, Professor Jha, that when you purposefully create a particular collection, you are actually not doing the work of an archivist, because the archivist actually picks up something based on the people who owned it, the source material, provenance. So
Yeah.
the three things are provenance, original order, and collective control. So my quick answer to you is, part of the problem with Kate Themer's argument or any archivist's argument is, when they talk about that, archiving and digital humanities archives are problematic to bring in the same space, Western archivists always assume that all archival material has historical context.
Yeah.
However, our country like ours, where colonialism has destroyed and exploited historical context away from us, digital humanities is a starting space for archivists to actually know of larger historical contexts and collections which may not have been brought out. So as a
Right.
digital humanist, so I'll tell you my own history. I worked on nuclear history, right? So that was my PhD work. So I worked with tribal communities in Rajasthan, doing ethnographic work with them. And part of that work and the challenge was doing an ethical ethnography, right? So the ethical ethnography requires us not to just blindly go in and co-opt the knowledge of existing minority communities, but enabling them to create their own archives. I think this is where I think digital humanities has a lot of space, because there's, for example, Professor Jha, there's a content management platform called Mukurtu. Mukurtu is meant for indigenous communities. So you can tag data based on whether you want to make it private or whether it should remain public, or it should not ever open out to an archive. So as we give agency to people who we have academic, traditionally as academics, we have continuously exploited, to be very honest, right? As we start giving agency to these colleagues and take them as conversation partners, I think digital humanities will allow archives to become decolonized. So that's
Yeah.
my argument.
I think that's a fantastic answer. May I ask one more question? I don't know how we're running
Sure,
on time,
sure.
so I'm going to, if the
We're
organizers are
perfectly
okay.
okay. We are perfectly
Thank
okay,
you.
Shweta. Carry on.
So first thing, please don't call me professor. It's like you're talking to somebody else. Everybody calls me Shweta. I think Madhu is also calling me Shweta, so that'll be better. Will
Sure.
make me feel much younger and part of the conversation also. So there are two ways. Okay, so the third question has to do with what you were saying, and I think that's something that some students here might also realize, sort of agree with. So some of us, for instance, who are reading in a script like Urdu or Farsi, go to portals or go to websites like Rekhta.org, etc., where the scripts, because it's easier for us. They're scans of the oldest possible, magazines, books, but these are just scans. You can't really do text mining, etc. So one of the issues I had was, and this is also to do with scripts. How far is this text mining and this kind of study possible with, let's say, scripts like Urdu? And if there is something that you can suggest which is possible to be used or is being used at this point by researchers, if there's any.
So this is a great question, because I actually give Rekhta's example in my own classes, and the work with Nastaliq has begun. Shweta. So there's lots of course, in the structures that we inhabit, funding for these kind of projects often gets limited because of institutional and other kind of considerations. But
we have no funding.
Yeah.
So I can tell you there is no funding.
Correct. So I think one of the major good sort of good stories about this is, there's obviously the Pandit. I'll put this in your chat box as well. There is the Pandit database, which was started by Sheldon Pollock from Columbia, which was only on Hindu text actually, or largely sort of Sanskrit text. Hindu is not the right word to use here, because the Sanskritization of Hinduism has happened much later. So Sheldon Pollock, if I can find it, I'll just share screen quickly. So I'll show this to you, and then maybe if that would probably give you a brief idea on the things that are happening already in this space. some reason. Okay, so Pandit. Right. So I just found it. I'll just quickly share screen and show you again. So this is a tab where, so this is called the Prosperographical Database for Indic Text. As most of you know about Sheldon Pollock, who's the Arvind Raghunathan Professor of South Asian Studies at Columbia. And so this is a prosperographical database for Indic text, as you know. The reason I'm very fond of this particular DH project is, if you can see here, it has this thing called most active contributors past 30 days. So this is what we call as a relational database. A relational database is not a closed database where I, as the digital humanities researcher, have decided that this is just what is going to be the archive. Here, people can contribute every day. So this is again about Pandit. Pandit is a digital humanities project with a unique and ambitious task to create a database for the vast world of South Asian letters. So as you can understand, one of the key limitations is, as Shweta pointed out, that because of the problems with, even there are lots of problems with digitizing Sanskrit text as well, but at least there's some attempt towards it. But in this particular context, I think the good news is work is taking place. I keep forgetting the name of the digital humanities project that is working on Astali, and I'll send this to you, Shweta. I'll remember to send this to you. For no problem at all. And there is one another reading which I must put in your chat box for you and all colleagues. So this is a paper by Wolfgang Ernst called Decolonizing Archives. He's from the Berlin Media Studies School, and where he talks about, you know, archives as not just being content, but archives also being organizational structure, and the Western epistemic battle between organizational structure and content, which goes back to Derrida's archive fever, right, where the idea of the archive comes from the archon, or the person who had the archive at his house, right? So it's both commencement and commandment at the same time. So, you know, who watches the watchman? Who gets to archive, right? Who gets to archive? So that's the key question. I think Professor Ray had a question. Thank you, Shweta. That was lovely questions.
Thank you. And I hope we'll have more conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely.
My question is actually in continuation with Shweta's question. So I work in the field of print cultures, and I obviously have been dealing with archives, you know. So the Endangered Archives project of the British Library has helped me a lot, you know, in locating early French text, as has Gallica of Bibliothèque Nationale. My question is slightly problematic. You know, I am remembering a conversation with my former professor, Professor Shopon Chakraborty, who's a book history scholar. And I remember Shoponda talking about the fact that, you know, you were just talking about who gets to create the archive. So, you know, like Shweta, I realized that even I am a digital humanist, and I have been a part of the conversation without really being aware of it. But, you know, when we are talking about the digital space, and, you know, especially with I'm aware of Professor Shukanta Chaudhury's efforts in, you know, creating the Variorum, the Vichitra. So this idea of digitalizing, you know, a text which was there in a different medium, print here, I remember Professor Chakraborty talking about, you know, he was lamenting the fact that one lacks publishers' archives in India. So the kind of work that Ulrike Stark has done, for instance, on the Naval Kishore Press, you know, it's very difficult to do those kind of work on the various presses which were there from 1770s onwards. The problem is when you're transferring, or whatever the term might be, you know, shifting it to the digital space, there can always be problems. You know, one can miss that, you know, a section of the page, or one can, you know, mistype it. And that in a certain sense leads to a continuation in a digital space of data which probably was not there in the original text, right? And this again goes back to the question of how do you authenticate? And, you know, so the question of provenance, the question of bringing it to a space which in a certain sense can be problematic. How do you address those questions in digital humanities?
Right, so that's a great question. I'll start off by saying that for me, authenticity is a myth. I don't believe in authenticity. I think authenticity is essentially just context. So That's
Point
good.
taken.
Yeah. So and to come to all of those people you mentioned, all my former professors as well. So this is IIT Jodhpur is going to have British Library come and present in exactly 6 to 7 days. And again, it's a closed presentation because that's one of the problems with us, right? We still haven't opened out a structure where we are making conversations open that we need to. So we are trying at, for example, at IIT Jodhpur to open out our special invited speaker series. So for example, I'll give you the example of the 200 years of Bengali print project, right?
The British Library project.
British Libraries project, right? So one of the challenges of the project is, while the kind of recovery that has taken place as part of the project is phenomenal.
Yes.
There is no doubt about that. It still reflects the epistemic stance of a few individuals.
Of course.
And that has been one of the problems with digital humanities work, which is institutional in this country, because my stance as a privileged IIT professor, when I choose a certain set of texts, is not at all going to be representative of what the epistemic functioning of that text is going to be. Therefore, Professor Ray, I think you correctly identified the very important point. We need more open access presses, right? For that goes back to Shweta's point about we need funding. So I think that has started to some extent. I think NDLI is a good move. It's a positive move. Shodh Ganga is a good move.
Yes.
I think these are, again, one of the problems as humanists is that we often only point out the problem and not the solution. So I'm going to try to take a different stance towards that and say that I am hopeful. I am not at all doubting with, for example, Spark and all of these grant funding bodies have Spark, Stride, have actually taken out funding for open access presses to be established. My colleague, Dr. Nirmala Menon at IIT Indore has started a open access press called SHIP, Knowledge Sharing in Publishing, which is an open access press. So, and to answer the last point, I think, if I got it correctly, about Shapunda's point about what gets lost in the remediation, right? So I think that's a very Derridian trace question, right? So, of course, any humanistic inquiry will have traces that will come out and will get lost. But I think the possibilities of loss should not prevent us from the possibilities of inquiry.
Actually, just a slight reminder to that. No, but if you look at the care that is taken at an archive to preserve a document, not allowing pens inside, and, the kind of care that goes in, when we are actually looking at digital archives, I don't think that kind of care is going into it.
Absolutely,
And
that is
what is getting lost is probably unintentional, and that is probably.
Can I come in there?
Yeah,
let me just finish. So while I accessed the Endangered Archives project and I was looking at French documents from 17th century, I also saw at the process of, who was, photographing those documents, these Archive National, Bulta, which were being photographed. And in a certain sense, I don't know, it was just a 9-to-5 job for that person, the camera person who was doing it. And there were margins which were getting lost, So, and that is heartbreaking for a scholar who knows what is getting lost. So my problem is there.
So Professor Ray, I'm going to interject there and point out and tell you that you as a book history scholar must have been to multiple printing presses.
Yes.
The person who puts the gum on the spine of a book is never considered a stakeholder in the printing of the book.
Unfortunately.
Yeah?
So, but
that is that. So the point you raised about the photographer who doesn't take care about the digital archive has been there in any technology, especially the book.
I understand.
Right? And I'll tell you now. So last week I was very privileged to have a conversation with, and I'll come to Shweta's question as well, with Shanghamitra Chatterjee, who runs an organization called Past Perfect Heritage Management. So Shanghamitra has been running both the Godrej and the Bajaj archives. So one of our biggest problems is getting people who understand the value of the material. So that is our role as humanist scholars to, I think, create the next generation of archival documentary, and that's something that our students need to know.
Yes.
That there's a huge scope for humanities students, especially coming from history, English, any languages per se, political science, right, or something that has a textual history, they have such a wide field of, and this is another, let me quickly, before I sort of conclude and go to Shweta's question, let me also lead you towards this initiative that was started in 2021, and I'm also part of this initiative along with the person who started it. So this is called, hopefully it opened up. Okay, so this is called MILI. MILI is an organization, it's a collective of individuals started by Venkat Srinivasan, who's based at NCBS. NCBS is National Center for Biological Sciences. And NCBS had their first archive started out with Obaid Siddiqui's funding. So MILI is this organization that is India's first archive-based organization. And this year, I've been part of MILI as well for a long time. And this is just an archives-focused conversation. If you're interested, I'm just also going to put this in your chat box. If you're interested to know more about archiving standards, archiving policies, and how it works, this is the place to start. For example, this year I led their day on digital humanities and the archive. So as you can see, all of these questions that you're being raised about pedagogical deliberations, especially I would say that there is an element of a little bit of problem with humanities scholars when we attribute certain value systems to archives that we consider important, right? So I think that has to be deconstructed firstly, right? I'm a very old school cultural studies Stuart Hall kind of person, so I'm of that you know, if anything has to be given importance, it is the right of the person who has collective ownership over it. Yes, I agree with what Nidhi points out. We romanticize what we know. Shweta, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
No. I was not asking a question. Actually, I was trying to respond to Shubhra's point, and I totally get it because somewhere I started off with the same issues as she has raised, but somewhere I've completely, I think, moved into DH because of practice. Like I said, I didn't realize, but I've sort of, maybe I'm a new convert, I don't know. But it is, I think I found it very empowering. I mean, in the sense that archiving, I always thought as a historian was something which was very specialized. It was something that was a different ball game, and you needed some, I mean, of course, it still is a very specialized field, but I think as humanities people, we can move into the, to digital archiving or digital, you know, at least have a conversation, even try it out. And I think that's where our students have a lot more potential. And I would completely agree with Divyajuti that, you know, when it comes to questions of authenticity and questions of what we are leaving out, you know, we are already teaching things like popular literature, we're teaching electronic literature. I think we have moved on to talk about a lot of things, which is not to deny the importance of, you know, let's say the fact that when you're scanning something, some white pages are left or fronts, and you know there's a whole value. They're very important questions, but I think I just thought the way Divyajuti ended his lecture is where I see as us as scholars and teachers moving ahead, and I see a lot of scope there in terms of DH. And I found the lectures, and like I said, I didn't know, but maybe I'm a new convert, but I think that is where the future for our students lies. You know, as somebody coming from English, I can say that. And trying to
agree with both of you, and I'm not, I'm nobody to deny, the importance of digital archives. You are using it every day. I mean, a lot of my work is possible because of the digital archives. There's no denying that, but I think we need to deal with the question of what gets left out, the intentionality, unintentionality of, because we are aware how that can change the entire understanding, right? So that was my concern. But
no, and it's a valid concern, Professor Ray. Why? Because that's really the topic of our Shubhra. So Shubhra, that's a valid concern because that's the topic of our 2022 conference CFP. I would really encourage you to go and look through it, because we've asked the question not what is the digital, we have asked the question where is the digital.
Right.
Because, and so we actually argue that Is the digital in those nebulous cloud spaces, or is it in the transatlantic cables, or is it in the human? So actually, the word digital comes from the extensora digitorum muscle that came out of human civilization, and it functions on 3 indices: the symbolic, the indexical, and the computational. Right? So the computational is just one register of the digital. We've been functioning on different registers of digital for a very long time. So absolutely, I think there is always, the offline is always part of the online. You can never take away the offline. The online exists because of the offline, and that's also a productive dialectical tension. I think that's important to understand.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I also think that with DH, we also need to be very, I mean, I see a lot of possibility of democratization of knowledge. I see a lot of possibilities of collaborative work right now. And I think with the kind of political climate we are in, this is the time to collaborate. And this is the time to, maybe I'm sounding, I don't know, but I just think that there are many more possibilities of, the kind of work that you're suggesting right now.
And Shweta, I think, I think you'll really enjoy Wolfgang Ernst's work, because he says that digital can be a decolonial tool, but in the right hands, right? Again, in the right hands, by that he doesn't mean academics. He means people who are not going to create another episteme of hierarchical-based knowledge, right? So that's, again, so that's just a long conversation. I would love to take you up on that. There's so much to talk about.
But thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. That was quite an answer. And the next question is from Madhumita ma'am herself. What is the full form of GLAM? It was mentioned in one of the
I think he's
slides.
answered it. He answered it.
Yeah, I said that. It's galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. So these 4 spaces, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, as has been, I think, explicated in the conversation with Shubhra and Shweta, are very, 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 very important collaborators in digital humanities. Digital humanities cannot exist without conversations with archivists, librarians, gallery owners, gallery people who work in art galleries, and museologists, of course, right? So that's the quick answer.
Thank you, sir. Now I would ask Moksha to give the thank you.
So I'll just take one question. I think there's one last question. I'll just take it up. You started with the question of being and the perspective of ontology. Epistemological dimension is perfectly fine, but ontological dimension needs more clarification. So Rakesh, I just want to understand from you, what do you understand by ontology?
It is more existential.
Ontology is just about creating relationships to understand being.
Yeah,
right?
being.
Ontology is used in computational software as well. You would know, 1970s onwards, there's the word ontology is used extensively in computation to understand how a particular, so for example, right now we have a syntactic web where we have an HTML or an XML language where a particular kind of object is given a certain tag and written in a certain language. That's a syntactic web, because the semantics of it is not understood to everyone. To create a truly semantic web, we have to create ontologies, which mean that we have to make these relationships evident to everyone. Okay, so the clarification on that one is very simply put, that the ontology of digitality is not discussed often, is my only point. That digital objects have deep and based ontologies. That's my only point.
And if I think from Heidegger's perspective, that authentic mode of meaning with the question of being. So could we see from that perspective?
No, I am not a Heideggerian, so I would actually go back to a much more basic understanding of techne here. So techne, T-E-C-H-N-E, which is what is the etymology of technology, as you know. So techne means making, and making has nothing to do with technology as an instrument. I think the Heideggerian understanding of being has been differentiated, dealt with by Husserl, by Sartre, all of them in their different ways. So of course, if Heidegger was here to comment on DH, Rakesh, you and I both could have a conversation with him. Because we don't have it, my quick answer, and might sound frivolous at this point of time would be that the idea of being itself has been absolutely broken down. We have a metaverse right now that Facebook is bringing in. Where is being in a metaverse? So I think older questions of being and ontology need to be recalibrated. So I would request you, I'm sure you've already checked out metaverse, and look at how metaverse complicates the idea of being per se.
I think Rakesh, your question is answered. So Shubhra,
So this brings us to an end of a fascinating session. Thank you so much once again. Could I now request Moksha, the president of the English Literary Society, to give the vote of thanks?
Good evening, everyone. I, Moksha Pati, on behalf of the English Literary Society, I am here to extend a hearty gratitude to our distinguished guest, Dr. Dibyaduti Roy, for making this seminar a meaningful and successful one. Today, we got a lot of information which will truly help us in life. You provided deep insight into the subject and revealed many interesting facts. I'm pretty sure this precious knowledge you gave us today will definitely help us in our studies and in the future. I would also like to thank our respected principal, Professor Masroor Ahmed Beg, for allowing us the opportunity to hold this seminar. I would like to thank our teachers for organizing this seminar for all of us, because this has been a really eventful evening. A big thanks also to the student committee of the English Literary Society, who worked tirelessly and made continuous effort to bring this event to reality. Last but not the least, thank you to all the participants and audience for attending this seminar. Your presence and participation made this event worthwhile. It has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you so much. I also had a great time. Thanks to everyone, all students and everyone, colleagues and organizers who called me here. I had a great time. And please, again, I would request you to, again, the first link that I put in your chat box, which is Dharti's conference that's coming up. Please go and submit your 30th November is the deadline for abstracts. We hope many of these questions will be raised. We'll create